Good evening. Good evening to everyone, to each and all of you. My name is Maria del Carmen Annalise, and I'm pretty honored to be part of this event. I would like to introduce the different personalities that have joined us today in this group. First of all, I would like to introduce Mr. Kofi Annan. All of you know who he is, but I will still introduce him. He's a former secretary of He's the former secretary of the UN. Also, he's a Nobel Peace Prize winner for his work towards a better world, which is not a petty or a minor thing. He's also the president and founder of the Kofi Annan Foundation. I also want to introduce Mrs. Laura Chinchilla, former president of Costa Rica, the first woman to hold that position. She has been the head of mission in several observations, several electoral observations. She coordinated the electoral observation groups in the previous legislative elections. She's a guest professor of the also Lorenzo Córdoba, who in addition to being a great friend is the president of the General Council of the National Electoral Institute. And it is thanks to Lorenzo that we are welcoming this mission from the Kofi Annan Foundation, led by Mr. Annan and President Chinchilla. Also, we are joined today by Mr. Jose Waldenberg, who a lot of people know also, especially those of us who have worked as part of electoral bodies, and all of those who are interested in democracy in our country, in the transition towards democracy in our country. Former counselor and president of the Electoral Institute from 1997 to 2003. I was honored to work with Mr. Waldenberg as Assistant Executive Director for Civic Education and Electoral Training, and I can tell you that he has been one of my best bosses. I admire two of them, and one of them is Mr. Waldenberg, a pillar of democracy in our country with national and international recognition in the field, and also he's a columnist of the Reforma newspaper and the magazine Letras Libres. He's an academician at the National University and an expert in politics. And of course, I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Alan Dos, who is the president of the Kofi Annan Foundation. And he is the one who has managed to get us all together. I mean, I'm talking about all of those who are part of this Electoral Integrity Initiative, which is one of the recommendations from the Global Commission that was chaired by Mr. Annan. Welcome, Alan. And also, we have the presence of electoral authorities. We have the president of the Electoral Institute of Mexico City, who also chairs the Association of Electoral Bodies for the Mexican Republic. He's here in the first row. We also have electoral counselors and other authorities, as well as the former president of the so-called IFE at the time, Leonardo Valdez Zurita, the former INE. He was the president. I mean, I see lots of familiar faces, friends. I mean, I could mention each and all of you, but we also have a representation of civil society organizations, academic groups, specialists, and representatives of the media. So we want to welcome each and all of you to this presentation of the report on the conference on electoral integrity in Latin America. This conference was held here in Mexico last year in the month of August, and we will have an opportunity on this occasion to reflect on the topic of electoral integrity in the region of Latin America. The Kofi Annan Foundation organized this press conference together with El Parlatino, as well as 5 Mexican institutions that we want to express our gratitude to, which are, of course, the National Electoral Institute, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Electoral Tribunal of the Judiciary of the Federation, the Special Prosecutor's Office for Electoral Crimes, and the Electoral Institute for Mexico City. This event gathered experts from 12 Latin American countries and experts in democratic governance and electoral integrity. And the participants in the conference included national, regional, and local representatives of academic sectors, legislative, executive sectors, judiciary branches, political parties, the media, and CSOs. We wanted to have a comprehensive or a full representation of all the different areas that are part of our society, including the participation, of course, of former President Chinchilla, the former President of Chile, Ricardo Lagos, who were and have been great advocates of democracy. I won't say anything else in this introduction, and I'll give the floor to President Laura Chinchilla. Good evening to everyone. It's a great honor for me to share this panel with Mr. Kofi Annan, former Secretary of the UN, for everything he represents. He was the leader of such an important organization, but also because of his work through the Kofi Annan Foundation, including their efforts to strengthen global debates and discussion around the fundamental issue, which is that of electoral integrity. And also, it's an honor to be joining Mr. The president of the INE, Lorenzo, who is a long-time friend, and to whom we wish, in the context of this process that has been set in motion, all types of successes. He has a solid team with a lot of expertise, and there is no doubt in our minds that this process, once again, will be a real success in Mexico. And what to say about Mr. Wandelberg, who is joining us? He is an expert. So I want to say that I'm kind of inhibited because my dear friend, Mari Carmen Alanis, asked me to make an effort to give you an overview of the main conclusions reached approximately 1 year ago, when we were precisely talking intensely about different topics that have to do with electoral integrity. So I encourage you to read the report, which is being handed out as we speak in its English and Spanish version. And basically, let me talk very briefly about its main contents, and maybe Mr. Walderberg can elaborate on these points or items. First, I believe it's important to consider the context in which this discussion is taking place, especially in Latin America. It is important to point out that there is a relevant crossroads when it comes to electoral matters. With some sorrow, we need to admit that there have been several calls of attention by several publications that value democracy, in the sense that the world is going through a democratic recession, if you will. Beginning in 2010, approximately, democratic indicators in many of the nations in the world, including the most advanced democracies, have experienced setbacks. Some other institutions have talked upon analyzing one of the main elements of democracy, which is freedom of speech. Many of them have said that the fundamental values associated with democracy, according to them, are under attack. and they are in a withdrawal situation or in a setback situation globally. In Latin America, we have an equally concerning situation, especially when we see that these type of conditions in some countries have reached levels where sadly we need to admit and recognize that there is no democracy anymore. It is that simple. That is the case of Venezuela. In Nicaragua, people are fighting in the streets. We have riots, and people are wanting to get some rights back. And we have other countries where we have a controversial situation. So the region, in other words, is also a region that is facing significant challenges. And by far, it is the region where citizens are facing the highest levels of distrust when it comes to democracy. Now, the other important element of this context that we cannot overlook is the fact that we are precisely in these recent years where the electoral process is fully experienced in almost all the countries in the region. And this is a cycle that will close in 2019, with 15 countries in the region holding elections. This year alone, we'll have 6 countries in Latin America organizing or holding national elections. So, I mean, this topic couldn't be more relevant considering the circumstances in Latin America. The conference made an attempt to address several aspects, such as the incorporation of the gender perspective in electoral processes, the role played by money in politics, and how to manage funding, political funding, as well as prevention and control of violence related to elections, which is an issue that has become an alarming situation, especially in Mexico, which of course goes beyond the electoral process and which has to do with the context of violence that is hitting this country. We talked also about access to justice and the media and the challenge of the ongoing construction of the right conditions so that the electoral institutions can have resilience in response to this context from a political standpoint that is highly challenging. Now, let me mention 2 or 3 aspects of each of these issues. Let me start with electoral funding. One of the things that we discussed was the importance of electoral funding, first from the standpoint of attempting to preserve the principle of equality in politics during electoral campaigns, and number 2, the importance of it to guarantee essential elements in terms of integrity. In these recent years, where in Latin America we have seen corruption really exposed, there is no doubt that we have still a long ways to go when it comes to corruption in politics, because it is closely related to electoral financing. The objective we expressed as a result of a series of recommendations included the creation of solid electoral funding and regulatory systems to effectively monitor the behavior of political parties, candidates, entrepreneurial groups that also make contributions, as well as the government, which often uses illegally resources to favor official candidates, and especially given some of the trends, especially in the north of Latin America, we talked about the integration or the use of criminal organized crime funds, for electoral campaigns. In the case of access to justice, which is a key element, we talked at the conference of the direct relationship and mutually conditioning between democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. In that regard, we talked about the need for jurisdictional bodies enforcing the rules that regulate the electoral process. That's fundamental. We also warned about the fact that the role of electoral justice shouldn't be limited to resolving on administrative controversies taking place in the context of electoral circumstances or situations. There is a lot more to do when it comes to justice to prevent fraudulent elections, to expand this ongoing protection of the political rights of citizens, as well as efforts to take care of many of the violations of these type of rights. Today we received wonderful news from the Electoral Tribunal of the Judiciary of the Federation, because they are promoting the so-called Defender's Office for Electoral Matters, which is a more proactive mechanism that seeks to attempt to support minorities that are oftentimes the ones that have the hardest time accessing processes, including electoral processes. Now, as regards the media, the main concerns revolved around the need to guarantee access as equally as possible to the media, and also take care of these imbalances that sometimes are created where you have contexts with a great concentration of ownership of these media. Also, these threats on the autonomy of the press and the freedom of the press, which is one of the variables that has deteriorated the most both globally and in our countries, and something that is part of the most recent debate, which has to do with digital technologies and the globalization of communications, including the manipulation of information, and all this world full of cynicism or lies, i.e. the so-called fake news, which we are dealing with in this era of the post-truth. As regards the use of digital technologies, which is closely linked to what I just mentioned, in that particular case, we approached the issue from two perspectives. One, the integration of digital technologies into electoral processes themselves. There are huge areas of opportunities there, but also they entail or involve risks, as has been recently discussed on the occasion of the elections in the US and some referendum processes like Brexit in Great Britain, as well as the impact of these technologies on everything that has to do with the process of information and sometimes misinformation among citizens, which are avid of consuming information in the case of electoral processes. To wrap up, let me address two additional aspects. One of them is gender equality, which is maybe one of the good news that we have, especially in Latin America. I'm talking about the evolution that we're witnessing in the region, which is an evolution that is consolidating us as one of the best two regions in the world when it comes to levels of participation of women in the region. I mean, this is the region that has seen the fastest advances when it comes to the recognition of the political rights of women. And in that regard, Mexico is in the run-up to an election that must be commended, because efforts have been made to achieve parity in representative bodies, partisan bodies, etc. Mexico is no exception. It has led these efforts, but there are other countries in Latin America that have followed the same path. However, progress in this regard leads to other challenges, such as violence and political harassment against women, for which we have to be prepared. And let me end by saying that when we spoke about electoral integrity, we made emphasis on the importance of observing very closely electoral processes locally. I mean, oftentimes national processes are the ones that garner more attention and more observation exercises. But we all know that in the light of the risks posed by organized crime and certain forms of corruption, where there is a higher level of exposure to these risks, the risk is bigger at the local level. Let me end by quoting one of the phrases that the former Secretary Kofi Annan expressed upon inspiring all this debate. The transforming potential of democracy cannot be achieved if electoral processes are essentially deficient. So I not only confirm his train of thought. Electoral processes are essential for the progress of nations and the strengthening of democracy. But I would add something else. Every time we neglect them, we run the risk of having an involution. Today, sadly, Latin America has at least one example in one of these democracies, one of the few democracies left in the 1970s in Latin America that neglected precisely this series of considerations and that had to do with democracy and elections. And as a result of that neglect, we can see today that democracies can die, they can be annihilated, they can disappear, and with it lead to scenarios with a high level of economic, social, and political deterioration in the country, in several countries. Thank you. Thanks a lot, President Chinchilla. We have people in the room handing out pieces of paper just in case you want to make any questions. But I must make it clear that this is not the press conference, especially for our friends of the press. This is only the presentation of the report on the conference on electoral integrity in Latin America. I'll give the floor to Dr. Waldenberg. Please.
Thank you very much. Good evening. First and foremost, I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me to be here today, and it's an honor and a privilege to be here with this session with Mr. Kofi Annan, as well as with Dr. Lorenzo Cordova and President Laura Chinchilla, with Mari Carmen Alanis and Dr. Alan Dos. So I will give my lecture now. We know there is no democracy with elections, but they can be done. Elections can be done in a framework of a non-democratic one. Elections are conditions, are necessary conditions, but they are not enough in order to have the existence of a democracy as such. So that's why talking about the integrity of the election process, it's relevant and important, or as Mr. Kofi Annan says within the leaflet that they have distributed to you, elections without integrity cannot bring legitimacy to the winners, nor safety and security to the losers, as well as trust to citizens, to their institutions, and to their leaders. Elections should be observed as they are. They are a solution. They are a solution, nor a problem. A solution that allows us to have a civil competence with regards of the political action that goes through our country. This is a way of different types of sharing that promotes citizens' participation, as well as builds these governments and legitimate governments. But in fact, one thing is that we carried out the elections, and the other one is that they fulfill and satisfy the necessary requirements in order to be considered as freedom, as fair elections. So that's why the relevance and the importance of this seminar with regards of electoral integrity in Latin America that took place in our country last August 2017, promoted by the Kofi Annan Foundation. Based on my experience, 5 main topics, I think, help us to think how impartial and how fair and certain, as well as representative and even pertinent, are our elections. and then I will name them. Impartiality with regards of the organization of the electoral process. We all know that elections are part of a process. They are not surrounded by the specific day of the elections, and so they can be qualified as fair elections. It is important to consider that all the pieces of the electoral process are included within this impartiality element. From the moment that they are organized, from the counting of the votes, as well as on the organization, the materials, the creation of the polling places, and the people that count the votes and all the things involved. That has to be designed and organized without any bias, because if one of these elements is broken or one of these elements doesn't fit, then this whole change is separated. So that's why the organization and each one of the elements that are part of this process had to be identified with this main principle of impartiality. Second, equity with regards of the process. Elections represent a dispute that adds all the numbers of the citizens that receive the different political forces. So, in order to this dispute to have it as proper one, it is necessary to have a minimum of equity conditions within the process. Two main topics are discussed within these regards: the financial resources that the political parties as well as the candidates have, and the behavior of the mass media. If in those elements we don't have equity, then it is difficult to discuss and to talk about a fair process. The idea is to build and to create a floor where competence is authentic, where the different offers have different real opportunities to face the different electoral discussions. In fact, that the conditions where the electoral process are run have this qualification of being balanced. Third, certainty with regards of the authorities. The regulative framework of the electoral courts are the ones in charge of giving this certainty in this electoral process. Due to its nature, it's characterized with this uncertainty based on the results. So the idea is to offer these channels so the authorities can overview, and this seems to be a good resource. That way, we can create a system that doubles guarantees within the compliance of these elements, of these instructions. Let's remember that this process, these electoral processes among us, try to give us different problems and accusations as counter-accusations also. The important then is not to find out those people that can create this exorcism, but the idea is to create rules and institutions that give a solution or develop guidelines. If we don't have a pavement in these floors and it's recognized by the political parties and the candidates, it is possible that these problems want to be solved in the street and by means of political negotiation. Fourth, and without exclusion, it is a strategical point that these electoral processes cannot be run through these political forces, through these relevant political forces, because the solution, if it's done through that means, that several offers that we have within society can compete with civility and peacefully, in such a way that if there's a significant and relevant current within that doesn't appear in this electoral process, then it will be difficult. And fifth, the translation of the votes. There are several ways of translate the votes with regards of the number of representations that we have. It is important to highlight this intrinsic superiority of one system to another one. And they all try to respond to different problems and to specific ones. And of course, there has to be a minimum of coherence within the system that builds this system. If a minority of the votes creates a majority or the other way around, that means that something bad is going on. There are other topics that are not within this electoral process itself, but they are part of the context that we work on, and are involved within this electoral process too. So there is security that faces in several regions of the country, or the insecurity within the governments, the political parties, the parliamentarians, and the deficits of the economic growth that doesn't allow them to grow and to include young people. Also, the ancestral inequalities that the CEPAL has shown a minimum of social cohesion, or the deficit within the rule of law. So we are talking about main topics that go beyond this issue of electoral aspect, but without a doubt they give an impact to it. So therefore, elections have to be built under a partial and equitative surface, and they have to be translated within the representation line. So let's not forget that they are not done in a vacuum space, but we have favorable context as well as unfavorable context to reply these democratic relationships. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Goldberg. Now I give the floor to Mr. Kofi Annan. Muchas gracias, Carmen, por esa presentación que usted.
First, let me extend my appreciation to our partners in Mexico and across Latin America, whose efforts ensure the success of the conference of last year, particularly Carmen Alanes and Lorenzo Cordova. Let me also thank Ricardo Lagos and Laura Chinchilla for their participation in that conference. Both are strong defenders of democracy, and the deliberations were much enriched by their observations and experience. I also want to thank you, Jose Waldenberg, former head of INE, who played a pivotal role in Mexico's democratic transition. Laura has provided a good overview of the report and its main findings, which we hope will invigorate discussions around electoral integrity in Mexico and beyond. As the report notes, many countries in the region are holding elections in coming months or years, or considering changes to electoral law and administration. If held with integrity, as you've heard, these elections will be opportunities to promote democratic values, further development, protect human rights, and increase security at the national and regional level. If they are not held with integrity, electoral winners will lack legitimacy, and citizens' confidence in leaders will plummet, sowing seeds of discord or even violence. In 2013, I established the Electoral Integrity Initiative, which focuses on creating the conditions for legitimate elections, making it possible to govern in a climate of trust and transparency. In convening last year's conference on Latin America, our goal was to assess the electoral trends in the region and beyond, and to distill some lessons from those trends. I believe the participants achieved that goal. This report makes frank acknowledgements about the state of democracy in the region and provides useful recommendations, as we've heard from President Chinchilla. I hope these suggestions can now be deployed across the region, and they will also inform the work of Electoral Integrity Initiative in other parts of the world. After all, the challenges to electoral integrity identified in the report are not unique to Latin America, and this is not the only region where the recommendations can be implemented in support of electoral integrity. My foundation stands ready to work with governments, civil society, and individual citizens across Latin America to implement the recommendations. Together, we can ensure that elections deliver only peaceful political change, not disruption or violence, and help to realize democracy's unique transformative potential. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, señor Annan. Le cedo la palabra al doctor Córdoba.
Muchas gracias, Mari Carmen. Permítame dividir mi intervención en dos breves partes. La primera, para bordar sobre las reflexiones que tanto la presidenta Laura Chinchilla como el doctor José Woldenberg y el señor Kofi Annan han planteado.
Annan. So let me say this: elections are not enough to have a democratic regime. There are several regimes, even democratic regimes, that despite the fact that they have the institutionalization of these democracies, they can derive from several concepts that today even have been known as selective autocracies. But elections are indispensable, are important in order to have a democracy. However, it hasn't been yet created a regimen that allows sharing of different national societies as the one that we are living on without the renewal of the power through the elections. They don't create these democratic regimes within this mechanism. So therefore, elections are important and relevant, and they are not enough. Taking care of the environment, taking care of the context where these electoral processes are run, it's indispensable and it's necessary. So now, today, so many countries follow several structural problems as the ones that have been mentioned already: poverty, inequality, corruption, impunity, as well as insecurity that derives into violence. Without a doubt, they are problems that affect all the aspects of social living. And also, they complicate the organization of the elections. So taking care of the elections implies, in terms of its integrity, not only with regards of the quality of the electoral process, but also the quality of the context. And in that sense, I mean the quality of democracy, so they work properly. And that means that we need to take care of democracy. The quality of life of those who live in these democracies. And it is indispensable. It is indispensable to have these elections with integrity. Electoral integrity has two dimensions, without a doubt, and this is emphasized by this report, as well as by the others indicators and the recommendations given. So, and they give us this evidence of these two guidelines or these two vias. Of course, this integrity is electoral. It's electoral one, and it falls into this dimension. Electoral integrity depends on the fact that they are elections of quality. And on the other hand, the electoral integrity is also related with this environment, with this context that we can summarize as the so-called social aspect of our democracies. A global mission and an international mission, as well as a multidisciplinary mission that falls into the context that we are discussing now. So it is relevant and it is very important for us to continue discussing the integrity of the electoral. We cannot say that, but the problem is that electoral integrity is related also with the perception as well as with the assumption of the things that we consider those living in these democracies. And yes, in Mexico we have problems, but that problem is not related with this electoral integrity, but it's related with this perception of the lack of trust and the lack of satisfaction of the big outcomes of the democratic governments. The persistence of those problems that, as Jose Woldenberg was saying, they evolve not only on the mood of the people, but also on the social cohesion that we have. In Mexico, Latino Barometer mentioned that from one year to another decreased in a 10%. So that same study of this Latino Barometer points out that despite the fact that the Mexican system is the robust one, and we have these economic investment and social aspects, political and human aspects that have been done in the last 3 decades. In Mexico, according to the Latino Barometer, 10 out of 7 out of 10 Mexicans consider that elections are not clean elections. So, but let's not confuse the electoral integrity as a topic of perception with regards of the integrity as a fact, as this study sets or defines it. This is a series of different conditions that are not only institutional ones, but also political ones in order to improve the quality of our democracy. So we are about 37 days about to have this election process. So let me tell you that as a telegraphic fact, 6 of the different points that we know about the election. Gender parity or gender issues. In Mexico, we are going to run the biggest electoral process in our history, where we will have this parity in the elections that involve not only the Senate members, but also a great number of different candidacies for several representatives and different mayors at a national level. And we do that not only with this parity element running the elections, but also with a series of different innovative and affirmative actions instrumented by the Electoral Parliament, as well as with the Electoral National Institute. And that allows us, even though we cannot predict the future, we can say that next July the 1st we will have, for the first time in the history of Mexico, at least 2 indigenous women in the House of Representatives. Because we are talking about 2 districts where the INE forced the political parties to show indigenous candidates, where all the candidacies are women. Secondly, with regards of the financing of the oversight of the electoral process, we're running a general election where for the first time in history the financing rules will be applied, those rules that have been implemented in the reform of 2014. So we have this public scrutiny that it's indispensable, and we have a balance that has to be done at the end of the day. So we need to demonstrate that these are not only the longest elections in the process of the history, but they will be very strict and fair. So in that sense, also I will anticipate that after the meeting that we have with the representatives of the coalitions and of the president coalitions, after listening to their main concerns, Mr. Annan was mentioning about the fact that this main concern about violence, this violence concern is not a unilateral concern. This is a transversal concern. And this topic, fortunately, within this electoral process, has not been translated in a political will of itself, but it is a concern that everybody has to deal with it. Mr. Annan was saying yesterday that it is good that you look at this like that, because after the elections, regardless of the fact who is the winner, everybody will have to be involved in order to fight violence. Violence is not only a fact or a thing that depends on the policy act or on the police office forces action, but the thing is that a democracy has to be involved in that. So, in that sense, we are facing an historical opportunity. In one case, we have this resiliency. After 30 years, if an authority in this country has shown that it's resilient, not only for the complexities that they face at the political life, but also to the overburden of attributions that they have that is given to them from the Congress. However, the great opportunity that we have in this year, 2018, is to take the right again of this trust of legitimacy that we have been built together. So, and I think that the best way to do it, and with this we can contribute to this electoral integrity, it is not only to do and to vote with this capacity, but also to give good results to society as a way of increasing or to revert, if we want to say that, to revert this lack of trust phenomena that affects society. So let me finish this, Mr. Kofi Annan, being so grateful with your generosity visiting us. This has been 2 days very intense, and we haven't finished because we will have the Q&A session with the press conference. Your presence here in Mexico, as well as with the members of the foundations and President Chinchilla, also contributes to the fact that electoral integrity of this process, it's remarkable. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I will be brief with regards of the questions and because also of the time, because Manuel Carrillo already gave me the first card with regards of the time and the schedule that we have. So I got several questions. So if the INE president allows me, these questions are for our three guests. And the first question, well, this topic was considered by several people, and this question goes for Mr. Jose Goldenberg. So within this process, within these electoral processes that are involved or immersed in this environment of violence, that it's not being affected, that is not affecting the integrity of the electoral processes, but it's affecting some citizens within these electoral processes, the role of these national electoral observers as well as from the international guests, it's relevant. However, they state that we don't have like a model of observation within this context of violence that had been applied in Mexico. So what would be your opinion with regards of this type of observers, and if you believe or if you think that it could be useful within this context of violence that we live in Mexico? Thank you, Mr. Goldenberg. This question is for you. So whenever someone asks me a question, I need to thank them because they assume that I have the answer, and mainly because of this topic, they can think that I have it, but I don't. I think that the problem of violence is a bigger problem in our country, and this is a problem that has given also uncertainty. That we know we have plenty of families and different regions and areas that have lived and that have faced this violence and that had left several disappeared people and murders and had broken families also. And we can say that those of us that haven't received that impact directly, we can say that in a certain way we live with this shadow of violence due to the fact that violence and insecurity goes together with us in mainly all of our daily activities. So this is not an issue, this is not a fact only for the electoral process, but also affects the electoral aspect. It had affected the number of candidates that had been assassinated, and this is not a lower number that this figure should alarm or should create this alarm. So, however, as far as I know, and I just know a little, the electoral process in our country runs properly, and even in these areas with high levels of uncertainty. Why? Well, because it seems that organized crime groups, even though we have several cases that want to create an impact in specific areas or in certain municipalities and halls, it seems, but I don't know really, but they haven't created this impact, or they haven't not limited the electoral process in those areas. There's an indicator given by the INE that out of these 150,000 polling places, so far the number of polling places that have this uncertainty, I remember, is less than 200, right? So in relative terms, we can say that it's nothing, or to say it in other words, we can say that we can be sure that on the election day there will be the installment of the polling places. People will go and cast their votes, and in that strict sense, we can say that the election has the guarantee that it will take place. Now, what to do to fight violence? Well, the only recipe that we can follow is that to each violent act, to each aggression, to each assassination that we face, we should judge and punish those who are to blame too. So this is the formula that humanity had found in order to control those type of activities, not to make them remain impune. So one of the defects that we have in our country is precisely the fact that most of these activities at the end, they remain impune. So hopefully, as society, as a state, as a government, we can take care of those activities through the legal actions to sanction them. So as you can see, this is a general answer, of course, and maybe you are not satisfied with my answer. Thank you, Professor Goldenberg. I think it's a good answer, and when we go to the fundamental and to the basics is the most important. So, President Chinchilla, we have several questions with regards of the situation in Venezuela, as well as the role of the international organisms. So, can you give us your opinion with regards of this problem that we're living in the region?
Well, I won't get into a full review of the serious situation in Venezuela, which is dramatic. But right now it's a scenario that has no hope, apparently. Democracy does not have an obligation to give birth, if you will, to good governments when elections come. I mean, people vote, and you never know. You have good and bad governments, but democracy doesn't necessarily have an obligation to generate good governments, but it should give citizens hope, the hope of coming out of good or bad governments, and that is no longer a possibility in Venezuela. So the question for many of us is, what's next? I mean, when we only know democracy as a legitimate way to remove those who are usurping power, it's difficult to find alternatives. Now, the international community, I believe that the international community has received good news in this regard, because there is virtually a consensus, a unanimous perspective in the democratic world. Europe, Canada, the US, and the rest of the countries in the region. I mean, democratic governments that follow these principles of democracy have condemned what's happening. We're at the stage where we are now taking action in an effort to implement a series of measures like freezing assets and implementing prohibitions to fly to certain countries, and actions against those responsible for the tragedy in Venezuela, as well as their relatives. There is also a file integrated under the instructions of the Secretary General of OAS, in hopes that this can be brought to the International Criminal Court, so that accusations can be leveled for crimes against humanity, because there are people responsible for systematic human rights violations in Venezuela. The OAS has been the body that has first and foremost been the main promoter of these actions, and they have created the right conditions to apply the democratic charter. But as we all know, a collegiate body is the one who must decide. The permanent council has the representation of some countries, however, that are loyal to Venezuela, and not much has been done in that regard. Some people have talked about scaling this situation up to the UN. A presentation to the General Council of the UN has been promoted, but I believe that Mr. Kofi Annan could be the best person to talk about this possibility of scaling this situation to the UN, even though we know it's a more complicated process, and apparently Venezuela doesn't fit that requirement yet. Thank you. Thank you, President Chinchilla. Mr. Kofi Annan. Well, President Chinchilla already is introducing this issue about the role of international bodies in the case of Venezuela. And I have received several questions on two topics addressed to you. First of all, what would you suggest specifically so that the new strategies in social media, as well as the use of new technologies, do not affect democracy? How can we prevent them from affecting democracy? Number two, and by the way, 7 people made the same question, this question, which may seem like a strategy, but I'm pleased to know that we have several people asking the same, because they are young people, and they want you to give a message to the young people about the importance of their participation in the upcoming elections and in all democratic bodies. And with that, we would close this segment.
Thank you very much, Carmen. I think there is great concern about the use of new technologies in elections and in the democratic processes. I think we've all read a lot about it in the United States, what's going on in the United States, and the allegations that Russia may have interfered. In the United Kingdom, the Brexit vote, they thought there were interference. You have governments and populations who are suspicious of the use of social media and new technology to interfere with elections. Germany has a rule, very strict rules of transparency in the electoral process, which limits or excludes technology. The last Dutch elections, they did it all by hand to ensure that nobody interferes. So these are real problems. Apart from interfering with the voting, one can also manipulate messages and send out fake news, given the impression that is coming from one source or the other. And those who put out fake news often intend to reinforce messages that groups already accept, or to create tensions between groups, which makes dialogue very difficult. And in democracy, you need to be able to dialogue, to come to a compromise, to move on. And so any attempts to divide, to promote hate, and to prevent serious dialogue undermines democracy. And so one has to be alert and take steps to ensure that this abuse does not go unchecked. And I think INE has already taken steps working with some of the technology companies to see how one can clean the environment and ensure that there's not too much interference with the process via social net. And where you see it, it has to be removed as quickly as possible so that everyone gets accurate information. If you don't believe in the information you are getting, or if you have a sense that somebody can interfere with the elections directly or indirectly and affect your vote, over time you will be disinclined not to go to the polling stations. Your attitude will be, what's the point? And this is why it's extremely important that we take firm steps to stop this practice. On the question of voting by the young people, I think the young people have to understand that democracy is important to them and to their future. They have to understand that in some parts of the world, people die to get the vote. And when you have a vote and you don't use it, you are really creating a situation where a society is organized and decisions are taken without you. Vote is power. Vote is your means to influence decisions. Vote is your means to decide who governs you and for what purpose and why. Vote is your means to change leadership if they are not doing what you want. In fact, it's very interesting. Amartya Sen, Professor Sen at Harvard, had a very interesting comment. He said people who live in democracy do not starve. And why? Because they can get rid of the leaders. That is, if you live in a democracy, some people are starving, but they can't get rid of their leaders. They can't vote them out. But basically, it underscores the flexibility in democracy and the importance of a vote. So I would appeal to the young people to vote. It's your world now. It's your future we are talking about. I keep telling the politicians that we should focus on the next generation. We should think of the young people. And I tell you, young people, you are never too young to lead. And if you're going to lead, it starts with responsibility and discipline. It starts with participation in your society. It starts with voting. And I would want you to really take it seriously and vote. It will make a difference. It's the beginning of leadership. take it. Don't wait till it's too late. Don't sit back and just complain. Your vote can make a difference. Collectively, you can make big changes. So go out there, discuss the issues, and vote. And I appeal to the politicians. Let's try to forget about let's think about the next elections, but let's focus on the next generation. If they vote and we focus on the next generation, I think we may improve the situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Annan. Thanks a lot, ladies and gentlemen. We'll have a 3-minute break so that we can then proceed with the press conference. And we're going to ask the media people to approach us. And if you want to participate in the press conference, please sit in the back rows. Thank you.
espacio a las cámaras. Muchas gracias.
She's giving me the floor. Yeah. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the press. At the invitation of the Mexican Electoral Institute, President Chinchilla and I have just completed a 2-day visit of this country's historic election in July. As you know, this will be the largest democratic vote held in the history of Mexico. Over the past 2 days, we have met with key electoral stakeholders to discuss some of the challenges that come with organizing a vote on this scale, as well as the broader challenges facing Mexico which impact the electoral process. We met with President Enrique Peña. We also met with councillors of the Electoral Commission and their presidency and held very informative exchange of views with the staff. We also had the opportunity to meet the Electoral Tribunal to discuss importance of resolution of disputes. These two institutions are central to guaranteeing electoral integrity, which is the foundation of democracy. I was struck by the remarkable resilience and determination of their staff, and I would like to commend all of them for the work being done in very challenging circumstances. But they cannot succeed alone. I was glad, therefore, that we had the opportunity to meet a range of civil society organizations, community leaders, representatives of political parties, to discuss our shared obligation to hold true to democracy's values and ideals. As the vote draws closer, tensions will rise. We urge all stakeholders to call for calm, avoid violence, and should disputes arise, seek recourse through the established legal mechanisms. Finally, we also had the chance to discuss with the President Nieto, the broader range of issues that could have impact on elections, including organized crime and violence, and of course, some of the issues in the broader region. The visit also provided us with the opportunity to launch the report of the conference which was held last year, and I think some of you were here when President Chinchilla and Lorenzo and Voldenberg commented on the report and its recommendations. The Foundation is grateful that we were able to work in partnership with Palantino and 5 Mexican organizations, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the National Electoral Institute, the Federal Electoral Court, the Specialized Attorney General, and the Electoral Institute of Mexico City. The conference brought together participants, as you've heard, from several Latin American countries, and the report summarizes the discussions. And most of you were here, and I don't want to repeat it. But let me just say that I and my foundation are ready to provide whatever assistance and guidance might be useful to facilitate the implementation of these recommendations with partners across the region. Before I ask former President Chinchilla to share her observations on our discussions, let me convey my sincere appreciation to the leadership and the staff of INE who made this visit possible. And I also thank you, the Mexican people, for your hospitality, the press who have been very active. I know you sometimes work under very difficult circumstances. Several of your colleagues have been killed or are in difficult situations, but we cannot underestimate the importance of the work you do, the importance of free press, and I hope you keep doing it and will not be intimidated. You have all our support, and I'm sure most people in this country support the work you, the press, do, particularly if you are going to help fight fake news. Thank you.
Muchas gracias,
Laura.
Presidenta.
Por favor.
Entonces vamos a pasar. No, me dice que las cosas.
Next, we'll have a round of three questions. We're running out of time. Our time is limited, so we'll have a three-question segment, please. Hector. Good afternoon. Hector Gutierrez from the Reforma newspaper. Two questions on the same issue. This is for Dr. Cordova. The PAN is asking for a reprinting of the ballots for presidential elections 1 month before the presidential elections. They say that there is time to do that they will talk to the graphic printing shop of the Federation to see if this can be done. Also, there is a possibility that INE will request more money to do that. My question is, are there the conditions necessary to do this? Do we have the conditions necessary to reprint ballots 1 month away from or shy from this election? From Mr. Annan, yesterday you said that there is some disenchantment with democracy, and that could give way to authoritarian and popularist governments. If we consider the type of political system we have and the electoral bodies existing in Mexico, in this country, do you believe that we would have the conditions that led to a situation like that in Venezuela? Do we have the same conditions? Because the leading candidate, López Obrador, the presidential candidate that apparently is at the forefront, is being accused by other political parties like the PRI of being a danger to Mexico because he is a populist. Do you believe that's a possibility? Welcome. Just to elaborate on some details that were addressed yesterday at the auditorium of the National Electoral Institute in other aspects, let me talk about the challenges you mentioned, Mr. Annan and Ms. Chinchilla. You talked about the challenges facing democracies. We're talking about violence here, about low levels of participation, about this disenchantment with democracy, and this can be the germ that has in some places led to the implementation or the rise of popularism and authoritarian regimes in some parts of this region, especially in Latin America. In Mexico, we are not exempt from these problems. We do have these problems. We are facing electoral challenges, including the killings of some candidates and even some representatives of the INE who killed while doing their work. And in this regard, the specific question is, what are the possibilities of avoiding this type of situations in Mexico? I'm talking about the rise of an authoritarian regime, not only resulting from what you said, because democracy doesn't necessarily lead to good governance, what Mrs. Chinchilla said. Can you tell us about it? One extra question from Carolina. Thank you. Councilor President, adding to what Hector said, there's been this request by the PAN. I'm here. There's another possibility, that of canceling or annulling the position of Margarita Zavala in the ballot, and because the PAN is requesting that the ballots are reprinted, and they have been told that this reprinting possibility is not a choice. And for Mr. Annan, if you allow me, I would like to know, over the course of these 2 days where you met with electoral authorities and representatives of political parties, what's your opinion after all of this about our country in this electoral context, considering that there is a climate of violence and things that the electoral authorities cannot control? But did you hear about these campaigns instilling fear and slandering against the contenders in the presidential race? What's your position after all these meetings in this regard? And also for Mr. Chinchilla, can you give us an opinion about that?
Mr. Annan? You first? Oh, whatever you want.
Let's talk about local matters first, local issues here. Let me talk about local things and that have to do with the organization of a process first. I truly respect the different points of view expressed, but there is a constitutional body of the Mexican state in charge of organizing elections and ensuring that on election day all the polling stations have the electoral materials required, always fulfilling the requirements under the law so that elections can be held. That body is the National Electoral Institute. And I truly respect the different points of view, and I understand, and I even share the concern in the sense that the ballot that shows the name of a candidate that is not duly registered because she quit, because she resigned to the candidacy. I mean, I understand that, but all these aspects must be made compatible with organizing elections. And the response that the INE has given is the impossibility right now, 37 days away from elections. It's impossible to do this. We cannot reprint ballot papers. And that is in an effort to make sure that on election day all citizens have ballots with the security measures established in the law. Let me explain it in a different way. Producing this security paper for ballots was completed weeks ago. Reprinting all these ballots would involve reprinting some 800 tons of security paper that we do not have today. And they would have to be moved from the place of printing. I mean, this paper would have to be taken to Mexico City by the Army. They would have to be printed in the national printing shop, and that would hinder the process of printing of ballots for electoral processes locally and in several states. Because remember, we not only have federal elections, and I'm sure that nobody would like a situation where we didn't have ballots both for local and federal elections in polling stations. Now, this issue about money is not the problem. I mean, yes, we could, I mean, any money invested in democracy is well invested. It's a matter of logistics and compliance with the law. The law establishes that electoral materials, including ballots, 2 weeks before the election, that is on June 15, should be available in every of the 300 electoral district headquarters. And I say it very openly. There is no way to reprint them, even if we were only talking about the 60 million presidential election ballots that were printed, and discard them and distribute them prior to June 15. Of course, this can be challenged before the Superior Electoral Court. Yes, if somebody has a complaint, they can go to the Electoral Court, and the Superior Electoral Court will have to resolve in it. You may remember that this has happened in the process. We had to discard ballots for legislators because we had to wait until the final decision as to the names of candidates included in ballots. Can we cancel these spaces? You must remember that, and many of you saw it because you were invited to this event where we launched the process of printing of ballots. All these ballots that were discarded are separated, and therefore any attempt to cancel ballots or cancel a logo or the logo of the party represented by this independent candidate would require a manual process that has never been done in Mexico, and that would demand a significant amount of human resources. And there is no guarantee in the sense that that would allow us not to cause delays in the process of distribution and printing of ballots. That's why on Monday, next Monday, the General Council will make a decision in terms of considering any votes cast for Margarita Zavala, even though she's not registered. Let me finish by saying this. It's not only a matter of ballots. Today, all the different tallying sheets are printed also. We're talking about almost 157,000 tallying sheets and counting sheets that already include the name of Margarita Zavala. Unfortunately, she quit at the moment where the stage of logistics that we were in prevented us from going back. I believe that it is an act of responsibility to the benefit of everyone, both the electoral authority and the contenders. We cannot jeopardize the electoral process and our credibility. In Mexico, ballots are printed on security paper just to eliminate the element of distrust, and not because we like it. We have a legal obligation. It would be a lot cheaper to print these ballots in ordinary paper, but we do not produce security paper here in Mexico because we want to make sure we eliminate this distrust always revolving around electoral processes. And the INE doesn't want to jeopardize this. Yes, in principle, we understand, but technically and operationally, that's impossible today.
Gracias, señora Ana. Yo creo en cuanto a la pregunta de si sería posible.
In Mexico, I mean, each country has its specificities. Elections sometimes hold surprises for everybody. In recent times, we've seen surprising results in several countries around the world that nobody expected, including with your northern neighbor. And we had it recently in Malaysia, and we've had it elsewhere. I think what is important is for the candidates to be able to express themselves and their views and hopefully put their programs out for the population to assess and decide whom to vote for. I'm stressing programs, not personalities, because the people would want to know what you're going to do for us and the country if you win. They don't want to know whether you like this woman or that man or you are insulting them. And so we should focus on programs, and your questions to the candidates must be on programs. You know, you've all raised the issue of violence, issue of inequality. Ask them, what is their program when they win? What are they going to do for you and for the country? Don't let them get away with attacking each other and not focusing on the issues. You never know who emerges, but the price of democracy is constant vigilance. If you, the voters, listen carefully to the debate and participate, I'm confident you will come up with the right candidate and the right leader. But you need to participate. You need to focus. Sometimes there's too much apathy. But the possibility that populists would emerge from elections is there. It happens in other parts of the world, and it can happen anywhere. I think in a way, Lorenzo has dealt with some of the local issues. The question was, given the violence and possible participation, low participation, that people would be afraid. Some have been killed. There's fear. Is this a climate for elections? I think from what discussions that we have had, I didn't have the chance to talk to the security forces or any, but from the discussions we've had with the electoral authorities, I think they are very conscious about some of these problems and are taking steps to make sure that people can exercise their democratic rights and vote. It does happen, occur in some situations, if in one particular corner of a country, violence is such that the voting cannot go on. Sometimes they take special measures, either postpone it and do it another time. But at the national level in Mexico today, I don't see any difficulty in going ahead with the elections. But one should be conscious of the violence, one should be conscious of putting in measures where possible to diminish violence and protect women voters and candidates in particular. And so one has to be very sort of specific, but I don't think one can generalize from what I have seen and say today Mexico cannot hold elections.
Gracias, Presidenta.
No agrego mucho más a lo que ya el señor Kofi Annan ha expresado en torno a las preocupaciones de dos de las preguntas. Yo nada más añadiría lo siguiente.
I mean, people vote, they elect candidates. Sometimes the winning candidates do it in conditions that are not optimal, which is normal. Politicians are far from being perfect. Some of them, however, have to do it in conditions that can compromise their exercise of power, like gaps from an emotional or ethical standpoint. I mean, there are many types of leaderships, but there is one type of leadership that we have been calling a populist. But here we're talking about people, and at the end of the day, no people. There is no people. There are no peoples that are exempt or free from choosing this type of leaders. I mean, no nation is free from that possibility. What truly matters at the end of the day are institutions. That's why we insist so much on institutionality, because it is one thing to have a leader who is irresponsible, populist, and demagogic in a nation without institutions or with weak institutions. And a different thing is that of a similar leader with solid and robust institutions. If you look at the case of Venezuela, once the intentions of perpetuating Maduro in power were made very clear, by then all the safeguards of democracy were gone. Checks, balances were gone by then. From there, that we often, all of them, I mean, we may call the U.S. leadership as popularist, but the circumstances are really different from those in Venezuela. I mean, sooner or later, it will sooner or later we'll go back to the possibility of choosing a different leader in the U.S., for example. So in Mexico, for me, the most important part in this upcoming process, once again, is to continue to work so that we can continue to have a free press with the capacity to control and file complaints and report violations. Mexico has solid and robust political parties and institutions. And yes, political parties will exercise control in parliament. You also have a judiciary that can annul arbitrary decisions that harm institutionality. These type of events are what truly matters. And in Mexico, no matter how many challenges institutionality continues to face, we must say that Mexico is one of the democracies that is the most solid from the standpoint of these type of elements. And you, ladies and gentlemen, are the ones carrying on your shoulders that responsibility. I'm talking about looking after the quality of your democratic institutions in the face of the exercise of power.
We're running out of time. It seems that the delegation of Mr. Annan and the foundation, unfortunately, they need to leave. They need to go to run to the airport. So, sorry, I'm just taking the role of moderator. So, this is just to take advantage of these public minutes that we have with the presence of Mr. Annan and President Chinchilla. Just to thank you, to deeply thank you for these 2 days of intense reflection. And I think that, and being a witness of the representation of the 4 candidates, the presence of Mr. Annan here, it's a way of fresh air that gives us this reinforcement with regards of the quality of the elections, of the largest elections that we will have here in Mexico. So, Mr. Annan, with all the gratefulness, and Laura, thank you very much for being here today, these 2 days. Thank you, everybody. Gracias.